My guest today, Brendan Dell, is focused on marketing, messaging, and growth for billion-dollar tech companies. And that can mean either founding teams that aspire to be a unicorn and need to get their pitch deck right, all the way up to existing large enterprises that want to expand and extend their growth efforts. Our conversation easily has a dozen tips that will help any marketer, whether you're in tech or not. And also, you may be curious about the distribution of sales that happen between brand and performance in various industries like B2B. Is that 50-50, 90-10, 10-90, or something else? Brendan reveals that at the end. You're going to like this episode. Thank you. Hi, Brendan. How are you? Good to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Brendan, you have a really cool role, job, company because you speak with and provide advice to founders, VCs, marketers, executives about the path to becoming a unicorn, or you've talked to companies that have already achieved that, and you focus mostly on tech. And I'm really interested in speaking about the role of marketing and emotional intelligence in successful tech companies, particularly in these early high growth stages of a company. So maybe the very first thing that somebody needs to learn how to do on their path to $1 billion is learn how to pitch themselves. So you've looked at tons of decks, developed tons of decks. And so at an early stage, what are the key elements to marketing your company?
So at a very early stage, you're communicating a vision of what will be, right? Especially if you're talking about a seed stage company, you're not going to be able, and it's Series A often as well, you're not going to be able to communicate a story of traction that says, our growth is this, net retention is that, or those kinds of things. And in many cases, you may not even be able to truly articulate a product. But what you can do is articulate a vision of the future. And having sat in thousands of these meetings, the big questions for VCs is why is now a time that's, why right now for a startup like this? And then how are you different from the thousand other things that we've seen that are sort of like this? And any great, or any effective presentation to investors is going to touch on those two things with a follow-up of, by the way, here's why our team is uniquely qualified to execute. So to break that down into simple language, it's why is the world changing that it makes this an imperative to happen now, and that technology allows it to happen now? How is that unique vision going to be achieved? And then why is this the team that's capable of doing so?
And one of those things in painting the future is that there's a problem with the status quo. And I think one of the things that you talk about is that there's a villain or an enemy or something in which your technology can vanquish. Can you talk a little bit more about that part and maybe an example?
Yeah. So this is something I guess it's useful to take a step back just a little bit as we talk about this. And so one is contextualizing the venture capital landscape. And for anyone who's early stage, if you rewind like 10, 12 years, you're talking about $20 billion in venture capital that was raised. I think it was in 2000. I think 2010, there's $20 billion in venture capital dollars raised, meaning venture capital funds went out and found $20 billion worth of investment and then put into growth stage companies. If you fast forward to today, as of now this year, so not even a complete year, you're at like 122 billion. So the number of investors, the number of companies, the number of incumbents, because we've seen this grow, right, is exponential in terms of what you're up against, in terms of noise, and in terms of competition. So you have to find different ways to break through. And what I've done is look, not only am I talking to all these folks, but I'm sort of a student of the game, right? And I'm looking at all of these different decks all the time and picking apart what's working. And we talk a lot about this in my course, $1 Billion Pitch. One of the commonalities that I see in all these decks is that, not in all of them, but in a lot of them, is that they choose a villain. And by a villain, I mean something that is standing in the way of change. And you can see this with Slack. They said, we kill email. You can see this with Salesforce. They said no software. You can see this with data domain. They said no tape, right? This is what was standing in the way of change for them. I mean, you can even see this in consumer marketing like Mucinex, right? It's got like it personifies mucus and says you're going to get rid of it. So this tactic of taking this thing that's standing in the way of self-actualization for the buyer is a very effective way of in it. And also, by the way, like villains and conflict are at the heart of narrative since the beginning of time, right? Like beginning with the Bible and every single movie that's ever existed. So it's a mechanism that is effective in helping people to like develop an emotional resonance around a change.
And so you've seen a lot of successful decks. Let me flip the question on its head a little bit. What are some common mistakes that you see when you're reviewing a deck for the first time? Is it talking too much about yourself? Is it not presenting enough of a clear vision of the future?
Yep. So one, you just nailed it, is a lot of times decks that I see, the first slide is look at all the fancy companies we've come from. And while that's great and it's helpful, if you are in, VC land, all they see is, fancy fancy colleges or fancy companies. And so this is not a differentiator. It's helpful. It's supporting to say that you've got a team that comes out of Google or comes out of Apple, but it's not sufficient. And it's also not focused on a market, on why this company is going to succeed. The second is lack of clarity. And this often happens because the team itself does not have clarity over what they're trying to create. So they're too nebulous with the language, they're too nebulous around the change they're creating. And then the third thing I would say is for early stage companies, well, it's useful to show a TAM, a total available market. It's useful to show that this is a big opportunity, but it's not useful to make up sort of the hockey stick graph that says like, here's what our sales are going to be when you have no numbers to do that. And I don't see that as much anymore, but for whatever reason, several years ago, it seems like everybody was putting those into their early stage decks, even though there was no historicals or even reasonable assumptions that it's like the old, if we could just capture 1% of this market, we'd be rich. It's like, okay, well,
Yeah, it's almost like that shows that the person pitching doesn't have a lot of experience with a P&L or with sales
yeah,
forecasts. I
yeah,
wonder
exactly.
how important is it to the narrative that the founder or the pitching group has a story around why they're uniquely qualified to solve the problem at hand, and then what are some of those characteristics that can really get someone to stand out in answering that question?
So Sequoia has a framework. Sequoia is a very famous venture fund for, just for anyone who doesn't happen to know, of how they want to see their pitches or pitches to them organized. And one of the fundamental questions they ask in that is, why now? And so I think it's very important that you address that because, people are both people in this industry are both intrinsically optimistic, right? They're betting on things that don't yet exist, but they're also intrinsically skeptical because they have to sift through a lot of stuff and they have to somehow try to separate wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And so having clarity around like if this is such a big opportunity and it's such a cool thing, why isn't it a thing yet? Whether that's technology wasn't there, whether that's, no one had come up with a solution, whether there are other solutions and they just don't quite tick the boxes. You want that narrative. And I'll say, just to go back a bit, one of the other questions or I guess mistakes people make with their deck is, you said, what mistakes do people make? Often people are asked about competition, and sometimes I see people say, well, we don't really have any competition. Well, of course you have competition, like, of course. And they're saying that is an instant red flag that you may not have anybody that built the exact same thing that you do, but of course you're dealing in a competitive landscape. So having clarity around what that landscape looks like and how you're going to fit into it is also key.
I wonder with the last 6 months, 9 months, whatever you want to call it, where there have been some challenges macroeconomically, concerns about a recession, maybe we're in one, maybe we're not. Have you seen or have you recommended to anyone that their pitches kind of changed to address the economic landscape and whether or not a company can weather the storm, or is that not really as applicable in an early stage pitch right now?
Yeah, that's interesting. So more recently, how do you change it to address the current landscape? This is a very unsatisfactory answer, but the gist of it is that it does depend on what the solution looks like. And what I will say is that I think right now, even more, you need to make sure that what you're pitching is a must have and not a nice to have, and that it's positioned that way, which means clarity around your buyer, clarity around what their jobs to be done are, clarity around why they aren't achieving those jobs in a satisfactory way today, and absolute clarity around then how you have built the better mousetrap to solve that problem. Because if you can't articulate that, and it's just like, oh, this is kind of like a cool thing that we might do if we had extra time or extra resources, or like, oh, that would be nice if I had, if I could have this and your thing. People aren't investing in those things. They're not buying those things right now, and they're not investing in those things right now. Whereas a year ago, 18 months ago, people were sort of taking a flyer, at anything that had, some possible, traction.
So you've got to stand out with your deck in some way, but I'm curious, and you touched on this in one of your recent podcast episodes, is about standing out in a large VC event. You're at Techstars or Y Combinator or something. You're at one of many. You're with many other startups trying to get your name out there. What are some tips or ways of approaching something like that if you're a founder, a small company trying to market yourself?
So I think there's a lot of tools and tips and tricks in this. And I think one of the most useful tools that people can think about to start a presentation with is an idea of an inciting statistic, which is, can you illuminate to an audience that there is some problem that they are not necessarily acutely aware of that is actually fundamentally affecting their reality? And an example of this is Gong uses in their decks, and I'll screw up the exact percentage, but it's something like 55% of open opportunities for a company. So people that were a lead came in, had a conversation, and then had dollars, got to a proposal stage. 50% of those opportunities never closed. So that means your sales team is losing 50% of deals that they rightly should win because you're coming all the way down to a company that has budget authority and need to have this conversation, but is not getting closed. Why? If you can't answer that question today, you are leaving tons of money on the table, right? And that is Gong's fundamental promise, is that you are going to understand why deals are closing, what your top performing reps are doing, and you've just made this thing an imperative. Now, another way to say that would be, Gong is a call recording software, and we're using AI and next generation machine learning to record calls and get insights, right? Which is like not an uncommon way that you hear technology described. So that's one example of a tool that somebody can use to really illuminate a problem and get people focused on some core issue that they're not familiar with, that gets them thinking about, oh, wow, these people are uniquely qualified to help me.
Yeah, I really like that, and also like it as a tip for PR and communications in general. I mean, when I talk to a lot of companies, the idea of the New York Times writing about them sounds awesome. And it's really challenging. The New York Times doesn't care about your company. The New York Times cares about what's going on in the world. And if you have some unique perspective on that, whether it's your own data or being able to articulate data that their readers will care about, that's something where you might get cited. And then when you become $1 billion, maybe they'll write a feature on you, but not before then. That's great. That's great advice. So we were talking a little bit before we hopped on here about leaders of technology companies often having backgrounds in technology, deep backgrounds in technology and engineering that uniquely qualifies them to solve a technology problem. But they're not necessarily experts at marketing, maybe don't feel comfortable with self-promotion or comms. Like, when's the right time to get marketing help? And or does that really matter at an early stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in many cases that companies that founders need to be the biggest champions of their companies, and that early on you're getting folks to help you articulate that story so that you can tell it, and then people to help you distribute that story so it goes more widely. When you should start doing that, to me, is when you have some clarity around product market fit. You have found people that are using this thing, that are getting value out of this thing, and you understand why, at least at a high level, these people are using it and buying it. You're getting, you're clearly not going to have a scalable sales process, but you have some customers or users, and you have some clarity around what it is you're solving for. And at that stage, it starts to make sense to bring folks in to help you go faster. But I think until then, and this obviously is dependent upon too how much money you raise and how much experience you have doing this sort of thing. But you can distract yourself from the core issue at hand, which is speaking with as many customers as you can, making sure that you're solving a problem, and refining that product until it works.
Yeah, I do think when you stumble upon your product market fit in an authentic way, then you can speak about it authentically to a VC, an investor, a client, press, and anyone, even if you're not a natural communicator or marketer yourself, you can still be an excellent evangelist. A similar question, since this podcast is a lot about emotional intelligence and its intersection with marketing. Sometimes tech companies maybe are given a bad rap for not being emotionally intelligent. There are a bunch of Apple TV series about those recently with big companies. What's your perspective on that topic? Is emotional intelligence important in building a tech company, and how can it accelerate your growth?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say that fundamentally for me, first of all, that while the hard skills, and I apply that to a variety of hard skills, coding or, marketing or sales, whatever those skills are for your function, all those skills are important. It's the table stakes part, and the ability to understand, communicate, and deal with people is what separates, your ability to lead, your ability to speak with investors, your ability to move a market, and so forth. So I think it's fundamental, and it's also fundamental to building good products, because if you don't have the humility to understand your buyer and understand where they're struggling and so forth, how can you possibly build a great product for them, and message that product and so forth?
So you work with a lot of companies on messaging. What's your way of getting the juices flowing when someone has a great idea, they have a great product, but coming to the right words to communicate to someone just isn't natural to them? How do you start getting in the zone?
Yeah. So everything starts with a customer. So it's who is the ideal buyer of this thing, and getting as specific as we can at an early stage. The more specific, the better, about who this person is. And then the second exercise is to understand what is this person's jobs to be done, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially a framework of defining what somebody is trying to achieve by a given doing a given task. And that could be jobs to be done in a very specific way at work, right? I want to understand what my customers are thinking, that could be a job. So you conduct market research. It also could be a job in a consumer, situation where it's I'm hungry and I want to eat something good, but I want to feel good about my choices and I would like it quickly. You know what I mean? And defining what that job is that they're trying to achieve. And then it's defining what that landscape looks like of available choices. And from there, you can start to understand and synthesize what promise are we going to make to these people in a way that we're uniquely, and this is a key element of effective messaging, is you're making a promise for them to self-actualize. So it's not about your patent or your code or your new whiz-bang thing. Whiz-bang, that's a really interesting phrase I just chose for this, but but it's about the outcome that you're creating for these people, right? And the self-actualization that you're delivering to them. And so what is that promise, and how do you make sure that that promise sounds unique enough that it can't just be copied by others, and that it's a place that's difficult to reach without your help, right? Because sounds complicated, but to use a very famous example of all this, whereas we transformed customers into subscribers, the clarity of benefit of that and the knowing as a company that I have no idea how to do that myself and I'm going to need some sort of tools to make this transition, make that an incredibly powerful statement.
I like that example. And I also wonder if you have any examples where there are multiple customers or multiple folks you need to convince. Like I think about Uber, and Uber needs to convince people that they want to hail a ride. They have to convince drivers that they want to be a part of the service. So they've got a supply and a demand customer. And then they can also decide, what's in the mind of someone who might regulate my service, like a government agency or something like that. And Uber might have just chose, let me fight with them. But what do you think about how do you think about expanding to everyone who might interact with your product and what you need to do for them for messaging?
So if you, and this depends on the stage of where a company is, but if you were at a growth a big enough stage that you were impacting multiple stakeholders like this, we'll make that assumption, then what you're trying to communicate, to go back to the Zora example, is that there's a change happening in the world. There's a new game that is being played, and that to be successful, you need to go about it in a new way. And so that's an overarching story that you're hoping people, when you're trying to create, that people understand and remember about you. And then underneath that core brand story, you would have your segments, and you would, like, the subject line might be different to somebody trying to recruit a driver than it might be to trying to convince a rider or whatever the case. But you have that overarching story that keeps your employees aligned, that you can communicate to investors, that tells your story on your website. But then this, how you actually then go to market in an individual and segmented basis will have nuance to it.
Are you seeing any cool new trends or things that you're really excited about with marketing that cutting edge companies are doing? I mean, for me, I think a lot of cutting edge companies, particularly in B2B and others, are using video as a way of connecting with micro segments and personalizing. How about you? What are you seeing the best companies doing right now?
So one thing I'm seeing, well, before I say the cool thing I think companies are doing, I want to say that I think what a lot of companies aren't doing, and I think they need to be doing, is a lot of the fundamentals well. Who is our target? Do we have clarity around it? Who is this customer? What is our offer? And what is the core message? And having the clarity of what is, the core fundamental building blocks of a marketing strategy. Because a lot of times I don't see people do that. And then they're jumping to the tactic, or they're jumping to the new technology thinking that's going to solve the problem. But if you don't have that clarity around, how you're trying to message and who it's to, the whole thing is lost. Some of the things that I do see that are, and for this audience, that likely goes without saying, but I always I always think it's important to say, because I've been guilty of it myself, right? Where you want to jump in and make something happen, but and also, just as one more point on that, this needn't be and should not be a 6-month exercise to determine these things. This is an iterative process, but you should at least have clarity and documentation around what those things are. Who you're for, what's the offer, why you're different, and then how you're going to message that in a unique way.
Yeah, as part of interviewing marketers in this setting, I've heard a lot of cool stories like that. Like a previous guest was talking about her experience at Starbucks, and at the beginning of every meeting, they read something that a Starbucks customer wrote about them or submitted as a review. And at Amazon, we would have voice of the customer meetings all the time. And one thing that we do at Centerfield is, at the beginning of our marketing meetings, we make sure that the thing that we're reviewing, really, we ask, like, what does the customer want? And then it grounds ourselves as to whether our marketing message really meets that need.
That's cool. I really like that, and I'm going to steal that. By the way. That's really good. I think that's great, and I think tools like that keep you anchored. And what you're pointing out is something that happens a lot to companies, right? Is we get so. I'm doing a project for a large enterprise tech company right now. I won't say the name, but anyhow, you sit in internal meetings and you start to listen to folks, and this, we're all susceptible to this, but you get so in the inside baseball of things that you forget that, like, the gobbledygook that you're you're also communicating to each other, like, the market doesn't care about your advancing the future of medicine, or,
Right.
I don't know, like, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's almost like being internally focused. I've been guilty of this too. Focused on my own metrics, and those metrics may be related directly or indirectly to a business outcome. But by not thinking about the customer, I'm actually doing the opposite of what I'm intending. I wonder, since you sort of gave an example of where you're making an observation, where do you see marketers at tech companies make the most mistakes? Is it where you were saying before, just being grounded as to why you exist and why you can help the folks that you're there to serve? Is it something else? What comes to mind?
I think it's that. I also think that because of, so over the last, whatever years, 10 years, the whole predictable revenue became a thing. And what that did was transform marketing departments into direct response machines, where everybody wanted to say, we sent an email and it created X amount of leads. And essentially you turn marketing into automated, unpersonalized, low quality sales. And there's a study that I cite quite often, but by Les Field and, God, I never remember Benet's first name, but it's called The Long and the Short of It. And they looked at what makes advertising effective. And they looked at this on a consumer side, and they looked at this on a B2B side. On the B2B side, the most effective outcome for advertising was fame, meaning you were known you were known as the leader of a category in a specific thing. That's not so we can use examples that we've talked about already, right? Gong is known as a leader in its space. Salesforce there's other folks that came into those categories, but they developed fame around an idea, which is you trust them to deliver on the thing that you're trying to buy. There was a study around what do people fear most at work, and it wasn't getting fired, it was making a mistake. So people are making decisions, right, like or around looking good in front of their peers. And so to answer your question, people are optimizing too much for this immediate effect, when they broke down how, like, what the most affecting what the marketing organizations with the highest lift in sales were doing. In mature companies, it was 70-30 brand to direct response. So it was tilted way more in developing awareness and understanding of what the problem that this company was solving and how they were uniquely qualified to solve it. And then only 30% of the time were they saying, convert on this thing, come get a demo, download this thing, whatever. Most companies, it's the other way. It's like 90% click here, sign up now, demo now, and they don't ever take a step back to tell their story. And it's difficult because we all have metrics to be accountable to, but it's not what's effective.
That's a great point and a great way to end our conversation, Brendan. Thanks so much for being here, and great to meet you on the pod, and best of luck.
Hey, thanks for having me.